In this video, I'm going to build this Mitsubishi Zero from Airfix. Whilst it is advertised as a beginner kit, it has 3 sprues worth of parts with a lot of good detail. Some people would say that the panel lines what Airfix makes are just too big, but what I would say, they are just perfect. The only negatives I could mention are the one-piece canopy and the bit of lackluster amount of decals. A good start is to always wash your sprues, especially when you use water-based acrylic paint. Here I have some warm water with a bit of dishwasher soap and some alcohol. This will help to remove any type of grease and oil left over from the manufacturing process. The build process is pretty much straightforward, with the added bonus of having closed landing gears. This is something not many brands offer as an option, so a big plus to Airfix for this one. Here I'm priming a couple of parts and the insides of the cockpit with Mission Models grey primer. Next up is painting the cockpit with Mitsubishi interior green from Mission Models. Here I'm using a black Posca pen to create the missing dials. Sadly, these weren't included as decals. Next, I tried to use AK weathering pencils to color in some of the knobs and buttons, with more or less success. I found them to be much better used with brushes, but keep in mind that it's really easy to rehydrate these kind of paints. After sealing in the paint with a semi-gloss varnish, I went over the detail with enamel panel line wash, and after 30 minutes of drying I removed the excess with a Q-tip. And here is the end result. In the end, it is going to be good enough as the cockpit will be closed with a pilot inside. And lastly, I am adding all the decals for the interior with Microsol and Microset. Now I'm creating a hole for the stand that's going to be used for the model. I use incrementally bigger and bigger drill bits to slowly get to the desired size without damaging the plastic. Also doing a bit of cleanup afterwards. Now it's time to glue together the fuselage halves. The two parts went together flawlessly, no gaps or misalignment to worry about. The wings were a bit tricky, needed some convincing, but in the end they did slot in their place quite nicely. I wasn't too satisfied with the gun holes on the wings, so I drilled them out a bit more and used a bit of quick dry cement to melt off the rough edges. The bottom part where the wings and the fuselage meet had a bit of difference in height, nothing serious that a bit of sanding couldn't fix. I am not a huge realism freak or a rivet counter for that matter, but that gap shouldn't be there, so I filled it in with Mr. Dissolved putty. One thing to note here that I do recommend these silicone sculpting brushes. It is so much easier to clean these than paint brushes, and moving around the dissolved putty is also really easy. After the filling, I had to rescribe some panel lines with my trusty hobby saw blade and soften up the edges again with quick dry cement. Wasn't too happy with the big gaps around the landing gear covers, so I filled them in with Mr. Dissolved putty as well. After letting it dry for 10 minutes or so, I cleaned off the excess with a Q-tip dipped in lacquer thinner. So, I forgot to mention one other problem. It is this poor excuse of a pilot. To mitigate this problem, I'm going to use these pilot figures from JP Productions. And here is the end result. It's okay, I guess. Nothing fancy. Now here you can see me attempt to do my usual canopy masking technique, which is to use thin strips of masking tape along the insides of the windows and fill them in with masking liquid afterwards. Well, it didn't go as expected and ended up hand painting it in the end, but more on that later. Before priming the whole plane with Mission Model's grey primer, I did give a spray of interior green to the canopy beforehand as an undercoat. The pitted tube wasn't too fancy, so I thought I'd do a bit of upgrade and make one out of small brass tubes from Albion alloys. These tubes are relatively soft, so you can easily cut them to size with your hobby knife. Using super glue, I glued the tube into its place and then primed it with Mr. Metal primer. Now comes the pre-shading part, in which the first step is to accentuate the panel lines with a dark color. In this case, tire black from Mission Models. Here you can go really messy, it doesn't matter too much because in the end you can cover it up with the main colors anyway. After done with the panel lines, now come the panels themselves. Here I use white mixed with the base color, which is Japanese grey from Mission Models. I use a very light mix of 8-part white, 2-part Japanese grey. I am trying to stay between the panel lines, not to fade them too much, and to use a kind of mottling, stippled effect on it to give a bit more weathered look later on to the finished paint. Again, at this step you don't really have to worry about the looks because it will be covered up by the final coat of paint. So when you have a bit of spidering, a bit of pooling, it shouldn't be a problem. And now comes the final coat. I found that the paint is a bit too dark by default, so I did add a bit of white to it. 7-part Japanese grey, 3-part white. This will help not to get the paint too dark after applying a coat of varnish to it. You want to make sure that the paint is applied evenly everywhere and with multiple thin coats. Ultimately, you want to have the pre-shading work to show through just the right amount to give a bit of depth to the model. Because the roundels are very simple, I thought painting them on would look much better than the decals. So I measured the diameter and used the handy circle cutter to cut out the roundels from a masking sheet. You want to keep both the circles and the holes you've just cut out. The circles will serve as a guide where you want to paint the roundels on, and then you use the holes to mask off all the rest of the area around it. For the roundels, I use standard red from Mission Models, no rhyme intended. To mask off the red stripe on the fuselage, I used flexible masking tape, and as for the paint, it's same as the roundels. I really feel that the end result speaks for itself. Seeing how nice the roundels turned out to be, I decided to paint the yellow stripes on the tail as well. Sorry for not showing how I masked it off, but it wasn't anything fancy. You have to trust me on this one. And as for the paint, I used Insignia Yellow, and you probably guessed it, it's from Mission Models as well. Now this one came to me a bit late, but I wanted to change the color of the wing parts covered in canvas, like the ailerons, rudder and so on. I read that those were generally whitish, so I quickly had to mask off the whole plane again. And yes, those yellow stripes as well. Just love to make some extra work for myself. Now I seal the deal with a semi-gloss varnish. No turning back from here. And before you would point it out, yes, I did realize that I could have used this stick up the plane's nose technique previously during painting sessions, so I don't have to juggle it around like a maniac not to touch wet paint. And before I forget, of course, the varnish is from Mission Models as well. From all the water-based varnishes I've tried so far, I think Mission Models is one of the most durable ones. I applied the rest of the decals with the usual suspects, namely microsol and microset. The silicone sculpting brushes turned out to be good for decal applications as well. As I previously painted the yellow stripes on, I only used the middle part of the decals which went onto the tail. After all the decals were in place, it was time to apply microsol to them, and I kept on doing that until I saw that the decals were conforming the surface nicely. Now here is the canopy after I removed all the masking I've done previously, and you can pretty much tell that it's... In some places the paint came off or the thickness of the frame wasn't even, and on top of that some fogging happened on the inside as well. Luckily I used PVA glue to fix in the canopy, so I pried it off, cleaned it and started over by hand. First I used interior green to build up a thick opaque layer with multiple thin coats. Next, I tried to eyeball the ratio of white and Japanese grey to be close to the already painted plane as possible. Again, I went in a bit brighter as the gloss clear varnish afterward will darken it. So as you can see, the end result is much nicer now. It is possible to hand paint a canopy nicely, but I would really appreciate if manufacturers would give us pre-cut masks with their kits. Here I'm using a small amount of PVA glue to put back the canopy to its place. Now I am gluing in the engine. It was painted with black primer, dry brushed with aluminium, and the top cover hand painted with AK 3rd generation acrylic light blue. After I sealed in the decals with semi-gloss varnish, I applied AK enamel panel line wash. I intentionally went a bit messy to give it a bit of dirty look in the cleanup phase. Leaving the wash to dry 20 to 30 minutes, I went over the whole plane with dry Q-tips to clean up the excess and to soften up the grime on the canvas areas. I used the sponge technique to give a very subtle chipping effect to the plane with matte aluminium. Here is the finished engine cowling made with black primer, gloss varnish, light grey panel line wash and some chipping. The propellers were painted with Mission Models black gloss paint and AK Extreme Metal aluminium. And here is the finished article. Sorry that some of the steps were left out of the video, but it is already quite long as it is and some footage weren't as good as I wanted them to be. Overall, it is a really nice kit. The parts went together well, detail is decent enough for beginners, and there is always the option to get some upgrades to it and putting in some extra work like doing rivet detail. I hope you liked my very first video. I do intend to make more in the future, so stay tuned. Please like and subscribe, and see you on the next one.